such a pleasure to be with you. Although I wish I was there in person, present circumstances won't allow me to be. But to be on this agenda with just some of my heroes and some just incredible researchers, physicians, advocates, neuroscientists, folks in government that I've had the privilege and honor of working with really over the last 15 or 20 years, even before that. It's really an honor, and I'm humbled to be sharing an agenda with so many great friends and folks. And I'm really happy that you all are having this summit. This is an important issue. It's so often forgotten in the discussions on addiction right now, given the incredible overdose crisis happening around the world. We can forget about the role of marijuana and cannabis very quickly and very easily. And so it's so important that you're all gathered to talk about it. And I hope you will take this back to your organizations and with your friends, family, neighbors, and keep this dialogue going well after this conference, because these are such important issues. So again, I want to thank you for having me, and then I will be happy to share a short presentation with you. I was asked to talk about legalization in the United States. I think a lot of the people who've already spoken have talked about that, which is great. I am not sure I'll be able to add anything. I hope I will. But for those of you that don't know about SAM, the organization I helped to found over 8 years ago with former Congressman Patrick Kennedy, we work with medical groups, law enforcement groups, business groups, public health, public safety authorities, really all over the world on this issue, and we're very privileged to do that. I do have to get this out of the way. I recently wrote a book you might have heard of called Smokescreen: What the Marijuana Industry Doesn't Want You to Know, and it really was a labor of love because it was my way of helping to expose the marijuana industry. It took me a long time to write, with dozens and dozens of interviews and archival footage and all kinds of things I had to dig into, even going to events I didn't want to necessarily go to with pro marijuana folks to learn really what they were doing and their tactics. But I hope it's helpful to you in your work. I think it's very important to make sure we don't conflate three separate issues that often get conflated. The first being, penalizing drug users, what we might call decriminalization. The second being the use of medical compounds derived from marijuana. And of course, there's improper and proper medical marijuana use. I think there's, approved by regulatory authorities, standardized medicines based on marijuana. I don't think anybody has a problem with those. And then there's, popular vote or legislative political approval of, outright marijuana with very little controls. And in the United States, we've seen dozens of states go that route. Because marijuana as a whole plant and in its smoked form is obviously not going to get the approval of a regulatory body, because there's no specific dose. It's in many different forms. And so they've gone the political route, which is really a guise for the third thing, which is the full legalization of marijuana, the commercialization of marijuana, and what would legalize not only the use, but the sales, production, and distribution. And I think these things we do need to separate when we talk, because we often hear about people saying, listen, we don't think people should go to prison for 10 years for using cannabis. But fine, but that's different than the full legalization of cannabis. And so I think we need to make sure we make those distinctions. Also, a lot of people have been fooled into agreeing with legalization because they believe in some form of medical marijuana as well, with number two. So I think we do need to be clear, and it's to our advantage to be clear. I think the top point here, which I'm sure has been emphasized already, is the fact that big tobacco today is big marijuana. These are the same players, slightly different marketing, but they're doing really the exact same thing. We're seeing major corporate interests get involved in the marijuana space, and there's a few examples I can show you, but there's dozens and dozens of examples, and in fact, in my book, I talk about a lot of these examples. But it's really clear that this is not a mom and pop movement, that this is really big business, multi-billion dollars worth business. And they're really following the addiction for profit model. It's what, historian David Courtwright calls limbic capitalism, which is really where your brain is really a pawn for somebody's profit. And that's really what this is about. When you look at, for example, in Colorado, and you see that 22% of the users consume about 70% of the product, We know that they don't need everybody to be using their product every day, but they're fine with a small number of people using it, but as long as they use a lot of it. And so it's an incentive for heavy use. That's why we have seen this huge increase in the United States of daily or near daily users when you look at all age groups. And it's much more common than alcohol. Marijuana and alcohol used to be very similar in terms of its binge or daily use. Now marijuana is really taking the cake on that in a very, very big way. We have 14 million daily users versus what we had 900,000 in the early 1990s. That's a huge difference. I mean, that's more than an order of magnitude. So we cannot underestimate how the commercialization and glamorization has led to daily use. And we're not talking about, the old kind of marijuana. We're talking about new marijuana. We're talking about these products that are out there to, get people addicted, get people to use as much as they can. And so, even if smoking has become more out of vogue and fewer people are smoking, thank God. By the way, fewer people are smoking because we have, as a society, rejected smoking. We've rejected the glamorization of smoking. And so when you do that, you're able to have that reduced use. We're in the opposite direction with regards to marijuana right now. We're at a very dark time with regards to marijuana in terms of its commercialization. And so when you look at the potency, and again, I'm guessing this has been talked about, we have just seen this rapid rise in potency, whether it's the plant material, to be smoked, or whether it's in these concentrated forms to be used in the various forms that they're used in. And we have to really understand that this should not be a political controversy, really, when you talk about the harms of marijuana. Now, you can have a difference on the policy and where you want to go, but when you're talking about what today's marijuana is and the harms, it should not be political. We had, former President Trump's Surgeon General, Jerome Adams, say that this is a dangerous drug. It's not your mother's marijuana. But we have the current Surgeon General, also say the same thing. Very, in fact, he agreed with the Trump administration Surgeon General at the time when he wasn't even Surgeon General anymore, Vivek Murthy. By the way, he was in this position in the Obama administration as well as now in the Biden administration. And he's saying that, public policy is outpacing the science. What we know is that marijuana is, in fact, addictive. So, I think it's really important to understand we should not allow this issue to become political. I'm guessing Susan Weiss talked about this and others have talked about this, but there have been some really important studies that I think are important to highlight. One is that the prevalence of marijuana use disorder among teens 12 to 17, we're seeing is much higher than alcohol or cigarettes, significantly higher. No matter when you look at the time of initiation, whether it's 12 months, 12 to 24 months, 24 to 36, or more than 36 months, we're seeing an addictive rate there higher. The rate is higher in marijuana versus alcohol and cigarettes. We're seeing calls to poison control centers, places that you call, phone numbers, when you believe you or a loved one, often a child who got a hold of a marijuana lollipop or something, is being poisoned, maybe having a psychotic reaction or some kind of very bad reaction. We've seen those calls more than double in really all of the legalized states. When we talk about youth use, it's important to understand that there's two elements of consumption that are important. One is prevalence, meaning, how many people used in the last 30 days or something, or a year. And the other is intensity, meaning how much did they use and what did they use? Those are both equally important when we look at youth use. And actually, I would argue that the picture of youth use, when you sort of lump all the states together, which is a difficult practice because different states have different cultures. They started legalization at different times. They commercialized at different times. Some researchers claim to sort of control for these things, but I think it's very difficult to do so. We can try. We have a mixed picture right now on whether this has increased, whether legalization is the driver that has increased youth use in all states. There's a mixed picture. There's different data sets. I list some of them here that say different things. I mean, it's interesting. There are some researchers that every time they put out a paper, what they're going to say before you read it, because it's always the same conclusion. Usually that marijuana did not go up. It's the same conclusion, for example, for Mark Anderson and Reese, that recently had a paper on this that got a lot of media, especially in the legalization media, in the pro-marijuana media. But when you look at all of this together, there are some important studies to understand. First of all, we have seen a downward trend in youth use of all drugs really for the last 15 years. And when you look at prevalence, there was a study by Bailey showing that legalization probably is reversing that downward trend in youth use, and that this quote, marijuana legalization may be working against hard-won population level decreases in the prevalence of marijuana and alcohol use. We should be seeing bigger decreases if it wasn't for marijuana. We have seen, when you look at the intensity side, daily use among 12th graders rising dramatically in the country overall, which I think is important to find. And again, that's very different than alcohol and cigarettes. We've seen a very big decrease in alcohol and cigarette daily use, but we're seeing an increase in marijuana. And again, what they are consuming is really important. John Calkins did a brilliant comparison, I think, where he basically said that right now, these consumers of marijuana, it's like they're drinking 33 cappuccinos to get the caffeine that you could get from one cola. That's the difference in the THC consumption among the average user. And that's really important to understand, because it means that what we're talking about today, even when we compare prevalence from 5 years ago, 10 years ago, is very, very different. Maggie Serta at Columbia finding that the prevalence of marijuana use disorder in children 12 to 17 increased 25% after recreational legalization. I think that's really important to understand. And we've seen past month use in the last few years, 2016 to 2019, among 12 to 17-year-olds and 18 to 25-year-olds really increase. It's likely, by the way, by the time this video is played, that we have new data coming out of NISTA. Hopefully you'll be hearing about that. But basically, the level of where we're going right now is not good. Several states in the last year have seen increasing in prevalence, Oregon, California, and Nevada. When you look at the state estimates of the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, that's really important to understand. And then this idea that somehow cannabis legalization will help the opioid crisis because people will substitute, we have not been seeing that. In fact, the Journal of the American Medical Association finding that the opioid crisis appears to be worsening where marijuana has been legalized. We've seen really study after study now finding that whether it's medical marijuana legalization or non-medical marijuana legalization, we're seeing increases in opioid use in those states. Marijuana use leading to opiate relapse in young adults. We're finding that. In fact, in this study of 26 youth and young adults, all of them said that cannabis increased their desire to use opiates, and they had thought it was going to decrease, but it actually increased. So that's really, really important also to understand. We've seen the hospitalizations increase since legalization in various states. Here's just a few of them here. And then when you look at the social justice side, because that's often how this is really promoted, we are seeing there has been over 1 million arrests for alcohol-related crimes in the most recent data, and alcohol is legal. That's, by the way, more than the illegal drug marijuana. Why is that? It's because when something's legal, it's used more, and you still can't use in public, you can't use and drive, you can't sell to kids. All of this is happening at a higher rate than the illegal drug use arrest rate. And so this idea that somehow legalization is going to help with that over time, I don't think we're going to see that. Right now, we're already seeing arrest rates are disproportionately hurting people of color. We're seeing in Colorado, for example, an increase in arrest rates going on since legalization, disproportionately arrested without a warrant or previous incident, all that's up. And by the way, the people benefiting from legalization, because this has now been going on in Colorado for the last, really since 2014 when it was legal to sell, they're not people of color. They're people that have always been rich, that have had the money to invest in. And so we've even seen the popular media finally report this story that we have really been pushing for a very long time, about how marijuana legalization is not helping people of color at all, even if you only look at the metric of profiting. Of course, there's many other ways it's hurting people of color. It hurts more vulnerable people in many, many other ways from a health perspective and a social perspective. But even if you look at the narrow perspective of, are you at least making money from it? The answer is a resounding no. So what are the policy solutions? What is out there? Well, first of all, there's something in the United States that we're debating right now called the Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act. It basically would legalize marijuana outright. And, SAM and Drug Free America Foundation and so many other groups have sent in comments about this. We're fighting this. We do not think this is going to pass. Thankfully, President Biden has been firmly against marijuana legalization. But that doesn't mean we sit on our hands in states or places that have decided to go ahead and legalize. We are still trying to keep them accountable by focusing on THC limits and caps, making sure the marijuana industry does not serve on rulemaking bodies to determine regulation, making sure that pod advertising and promotions are prohibited. But that's, by the way, very difficult to do. In fact, in California, they're about to pass a law that will allow billboards to be on highways. So, I mean, these are even happening in places where they said, no, 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 we won't allow that. Kevin, you're crazy for saying that. You're lying about it. Well, we're seeing it all happen right in front of our eyes. So it is very difficult to tamp down once it is legalized. And we don't give up, we still push, but it is difficult. And so it's better to prevent it in the first place. In states that haven't, we're very open to removing the criminal penalties for low-level possession. I mean, I don't know many places in sort of the West where this is happening anyhow. But we need to discourage the use of marijuana. People caught repeatedly need to be directed to treatment. This is a growing problem, and we need a science-based awareness campaigns. We need to talk about drugged driving, which, by the way, we've seen big increases in impaired driving in the United States, especially in places that have legalized. So all of these things are very important. We have tons of resources on our website. We have a very big lessons learned document that I'm proud of that you can find at our website, learnaboutsam.org. But I wanted to just end with kind of a little pivot, but I think it's related and I think it's important, which is really where we are now. Where we are now in the US is the fact that we are seeing several states now go ahead and legalize or decriminalize the possession at the very least, but also the sales in some other places like Colorado of other drugs, other than marijuana. And they started with marijuana, but they're moving forward. We're now looking at, of course, this idea in Europe that has sort of had, I think, fits and starts of safe injection sites. We're looking at which they call safe injection sites, which are in a sense heroin shooting galleries. There's this push to legalize psychedelics. They're push to legalize other drugs. This is what is happening with drug policy. There is this move, and this isn't new, by the way. We've seen these kinds of moves over the last 200 years go back and forth, but we're now going towards that kind of very loose laws. We're seeing in places like British Columbia and Vancouver, where I'm at right now, pure heroin and pure methamphetamine being passed out on the street. And being allowed. I mean, no one is getting in trouble for this. In fact, by the way, the drug overdose death rate in British Columbia is the worst in the developed world. And British Columbia has been doubling down on very extreme harm reduction. I'm not talking about the kinds of harm reduction interventions that we would all agree with like medication assisted treatment or, sometimes low threshold methadone treatment or ways to really get people engaged with the social service sector. I'm talking about very extreme things like heroin, pure heroin being passed out and pure methamphetamine being passed out. And so we hear all the time about the US overdose epidemic, which is a huge problem, but we need to understand, the biggest problem is often in the places that have been enabling addiction in the first place. And this is where I worry marijuana legalization is quickly going to. I do want to say something quickly about Portugal, because I think Portugal is often mischaracterized by legalization advocates for their own benefit. Portugal, while I wouldn't say is a model of drug policy in any way, but they did not legalize drugs. They kept the supply illegal. They diverted users to dissuasion commissions. I think there's mixed data on whether that's been good or not. But I think the consideration of culture is very, very important, sometimes more important than policy. And so when we generalize, I think we have to be very careful. I think countries like Sweden are an example of very good policy, a very balanced and humane policy. And we've seen positive impacts from a country like Sweden. What we're trying to do is educate, prevent with the science, hold the industry accountable, advocate, and engage with the media. It's not an easy task, as you can imagine, especially right now in the United States, as I'm sure you've heard. But we're trying to take the knowledge, the data from some of the researchers you're familiar with, and really elevate that work and make sure that lawmakers hear about it. Because I always say there's no PR in PhD. In other words, when we get our PhD, like I did at Oxford, we didn't learn about public relations. I learned about public relations when I worked in the White House, and I was sort of given a master class, in that kind of by doing, and that's how I learned. But that's not very common, and so we got to get the data out there in language that people can understand and really communicate this effectively. And I think that's what you're trying to do today. So if we can help you at all, let us know. Our website is learnaboutsam.org. You can always email me at kevin@learnaboutsam.org. And I really want to thank you for all the work you're doing to push the needle in the right direction and working with so many different folks. And again, it's really an honor to be part of this today. Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you, Kevin, for your insightful presentation and for joining us.
Hi, everybody.
Live.
Kevin Sabet here. It's such a pleasure
I think the videos
to be with you.
The videos should be stopped. The sound? But, okay, thank you. That was the video. That was not live. We repeated the video again. But yeah, I want to summarize it very briefly to get the connection with Kevin. Yeah, as he said, like it's mentioned that major corporate interest in marijuana is that where addiction is actually being used for profit, and at the same time, the potency and the use has increased not through only smoking, but also through other easily accessible products. These are concerning facts, and therefore cannabis should not be used as a political game. Also, the increase of opioids, arrest rates, and others show that legalization is not living up to its promises, and that once the small doors open to the legalization of marijuana, more will follow, such as the commercialization. And I think, Kevin, you're live with us right now.
Yes, I am. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. Big applause. Thanks for your contribution. And
thank you. I made sure to wear the same shirt.
Very good. Very sync, as if it wasn't pre-recorded. Thank you for being with us today so early and for answering our questions. First, I would like to go into the audience here. If there's any questions before we go into the virtual audience. Are there any questions? Yeah, there.
Hi, Kevin. Really enjoyed the talk. Bobby Smith here from Dublin. Kevin, just a question that maybe hasn't been touched on over the last day or two, but you might be able to comment on it. One of the ambitions or aspirations of legalization was to eliminate or put a serious dent into the criminal market, the black market. My observations from Ireland don't suggest to me that that's not happening so well, but I just wondered if you could comment on that.
Sure. Well, Bobby, thank you for the question and for your incredible leadership in Ireland. Boy, Irish drug policy has had so many twists and turns, and sometimes hard to see who's saying what and what the current policy is. And you and Mary Cannon and so many people have just done incredible work there. For your leadership really is noticed by everybody around the world. So I want to thank you first, and I mean that. We were promised that the underground market would go away. In fact, when I would debate about big marijuana, I would have people say, well, we already have big marijuana, Kevin. It's called the drug cartels. And that's big marijuana. And we want to get rid of the drug cartels because we'd rather have a corporation. If you have a dispute, the corporation goes to a court of law and settles it civilly rather than with a gunfight. And unfortunately, that's a great theory, and I wish that were true, but it's not true at all. We've actually seen the underground illicit market thrive under legalization, and in my short time, I didn't have a chance to talk about it, but we have a lot of evidence in all of these states of the underground market just continuing to thrive. Why? Because they can undercut the legal price. They can still make very good money, and it's simple economics. They can still sell it for cheaper. The marijuana market, with the exception of a few urban centers, and this may sound controversial, but the marijuana supply market is not an overly violent market. It's interesting. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is most people get marijuana from friends, especially kids, family members, or sort of other folks are involved. And now we do have certain cities, actually, some of them are in legal states, where the cartels are very strong and they absolutely are violent and they're selling marijuana and a lot of other things. But generally, people are okay with going to the same person they've gone to for 20 years and not paying a huge tax and getting whatever they want whenever they want. Marijuana poisoning, for example, from like unsafe supply is not a common occurrence. It happens sometimes, but it's not something common at all. So, there's a lot of incentives for the black market to stay and get even bigger. And by the way, we've seen this in places that have legalized certain kinds of gambling. Illicit gambling doesn't go down when you legalize gambling. And so I'm not super surprised. And I know we're going to hear in a minute, actually, from a very good friend of mine and also our SAM advisory board member, Dr. Chris Thurstone, who's from Colorado, and I'm sure, although he talks about kids in the clinical side, I'm sure he'll talk about the black market a little bit too, if you ask. But yeah, we're not seeing this go away. California is another huge state with an underground economy that's thriving. The legal shops are not able to compete. By the way, if you want non-American evidence, if you look at Canada, the Auditor General I guess the ombudsman, as they call them, in the largest province, Ontario, recently came out with a report just talking about how the black market was bigger than ever, even though they've legalized marijuana nationwide there. So we're not seeing the underground market go away at all.
Thank you, Kevin. I have a question from an online participant, and then we will go to Carlton. This one is from Mary Cannon. She thanks you for a great talk, and it's very nice to hear your positive attitude despite the difficulties. She has just 2 comments. One, can I just ask about medical marijuana? There is actually only one good evidence for one condition, childhood onset epilepsy. Perhaps we should be clear about this. And second, do you have advice of how we can prevent our countries going down the route of the US in terms of marijuana and lesson learned?
Yeah. Well, the second question is vital, and we can have maybe we should have our next conference on that, because that could be a lot. But I'll answer the second question first, I guess. To prevent that, I mean, in the United States, and I talk about this in my book a lot, this was a long time coming with this move towards legalization, but it started by, just a few people without a lot of money 40 or 50 years ago. And then it got turbo boosted when the billionaires came in and funded it. But it started with medical marijuana, basically saying we need to have compassion because, as human beings, we're compassionate. We see somebody suffering. We want them to have anything that will help them, whether it's marijuana or anything else, especially if we're not a physician or a scientist, we don't understand that there are other medicines, that dosage is important, all of these things. It's very easy to say, well, sure, I mean, marijuana is not going to kill them, and their breast cancer is killing them. So yes, let's give them marijuana. Or in the case of the United States, during the AIDS epidemic, really in the 80s, this was used. So my advice would be get ahead of it. And yes, this answers number one as well. Question one. There are medicinal applications of certain components like CBD. So far, only childhood epilepsy for pure CBD. THC, there is some evidence, although it's not great. And actually, recent research is less enthusiastic, but there was better evidence for certain kinds of cancer pain, maybe THC, and as well as, again, back in the AIDS epidemic when wasting was a big issue. In other words, people would waste away because they wouldn't eat. We didn't have antiretroviral drugs for HIV. People were getting full-blown AIDS and they were dying of all, Kaposi sarcoma and wasting and on and on. We don't see that anymore in the developed world, at least, because we have medications. But back then, we used to give a synthetic THC Marinol for appetite, because it would help with your appetite and it would help you from wasting away. That's not as needed anymore. People are not wasting away in the developed world from HIV/AIDS. So they're living full lives, as we know. So I would say get ahead of it, show compassion, but show that there could be medicinal aspects of the plant in a very specific, way that's a medicine, and make sure you educate on the harms, because I think in the United States, we sort of thought that the just say no era, I think, of the 1980s would last forever, and that people would always believe that it's just not good and drugs are just bad. Drugs equals bad, and that's it. But we learned that this can quickly turn with a lot of money, with basically a lot of us just kind of, I think, being a little bit complacent because we thought that we had this great, huge movement of parents and others in the 1980s that swept the country and just say no. And television programs were playing, scripts that were anti-drug. I mean, you couldn't fathom it now. And that was the norm, but it changed very quickly because of medical. And then basically people saying, this isn't that bad at all. Actually, it's good for you, and on and on. So you need to get ahead of it. You need to make sure you have evidence-based, prevention, and talking points so that people can really understand that there are harms, because sometimes people don't understand there are harms until they've experienced them. And that's obviously not good, because not everyone's going to experience harms at the same time. So we need to educate. We need to talk about how, frankly, use the U.S. as an example. It has not been a success story in the United States to legalize marijuana. On almost every indication, we're seeing numbers going the wrong way. Look, has the marijuana industry created jobs? Yes, it has created jobs. I wouldn't say that there are good jobs, but it's sure. So there are positives that they will point at for the economy. But when you look at the economy overall, with cost to society, and you add up all the costs that are related, it doesn't come close. Whether it's revenue or job creation, frankly, it's a job killer, because we now have people, where people are using their high, they come to work, productivity issues and all kinds of issues. So we need to do that calculation for policymakers as well, who are sometimes very economically minded.
Thank you for your great answer. Carlton, the last question honor is yours.
Okay. Hey, Kevin.
Hi.
Hey, I know in our field we talk a lot and share a lot about the science that we understand is prevalent, and the issues to try to dissuade folks from the legalization movement and the like, as a way of engaging folks. I believe fully that we have to move beyond the typical public health field and engage the broader populace, engage the mass populace into this movement in order to gain more traction. The legalization movement has more money, but we actually have more people if we were able to mobilize the silent majority, so to speak. You were among the first to share with me the importance of talking about the commercialization that is really at the head of it. We talk a lot about the science, but I believe that the commercialization aspect is something that can really help to engage the broader populace, because I believe folks don't like to be lied to. And when they feel as though they've been lied to, it can serve as a catalyst for the movement. I was wondering if you can elaborate just a bit about that. And my second question or point is, there's an incredible black and white picture on your left that I was wondering if you had anything to say about. But anyway, she is gorgeous.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, I was saying, boy, if the legalizers thought I was anti-drug before I had a child, imagine what would happen after I have a child. You don't want to you don't want to get in my head now when it comes to drugs and kids. Yes, that's my near 2-year-old Lua, and she's amazing and probably going to get up any minute. Thank you. Yes, you can clap. You should clap for my wife much more than you should clap for me. But here I will. I'll show you a little pic. Now, Carlton, what you made me do is show me a picture of her. That's her yesterday. We're still figuring out why she has blue eyes. Maybe there's some Nordic blood somewhere in there, I think. See, you asked about my daughter. Now I can't remember your first question. Okay, yes. So commercialization. Yes, you're exactly right that we need to be talking about this, not so much with a lot of scientific terms for the average person, but really how this is about big business, and this is about commercializing and promoting. And you're right, people don't like that. I mean, that is one thing that's going for us, is we're actually in an era where people are rejecting this sort of corporate greed and manufactured consent about all kinds of things, and so fueled by money and capitalism. And so that is what the marijuana industry is all about. That's what I've tried to expose in the book, actually, is that this is really about greed and about promotion and commercialization. They don't want people to just use a joint occasionally as an adult. That's not the goal, because they won't make money that way. They need to promote and commercialize and normalize. And even some of the older legalization advocates, people like Ethan Nadelman, who's sort of the godfather of all of this over the last 30 years, is openly lamenting that maybe marijuana has become too normalized and too accepted. And well, duh, yeah, that is absolutely what's happening. But that is now the intent of the people that are really driving this, which is the corporate industry. In your countries, you may have some old advocates, some old, if I can use the word, hippies and folks who just want to smoke a little weed now and again. We need to legalize it. What they don't understand is that their whole movement is hijacked by a massive corporate commercialization movement. And that's what we have to get people to really understand. Just kind of the intersection of that point in kids. I heard a story about a group of kids that were given Happy Meals from McDonald's. And this goal was to see what message would work on the kids so they wouldn't eat a McDonald's Happy Meal. And I got to admit, my daughter's had McDonald's and she loves it. There's addictive things in there, I think. And basically, what happened with the kids was, if you told the kid, like a 5-year-old, that the Happy Meal would increase your risk of heart disease and cholesterol and these scientific terms, they didn't care. They weren't moved by that. But when you told the kid that look, the reason there's a toy in your Happy Meal is to trick you into making you think the food tastes good, and you buy it for the toy and not for the food, because the food is garbage. When you told that to these little children, like under 10 years old, that convinced them not to eat the Happy Meal. It wasn't so much the scientific data. Now, we need the scientific data. I'm not saying that we don't need that. But your point for the masses is we need to talk about this sometimes in different ways, because if they haven't experienced, psychosis, schizophrenia, 8-point IQ loss, cognitive deficit, short-term memory, on and on and on. If they haven't experienced that, they will often just say that, well, I don't believe you. And so a way to get, especially for teenagers, to get that teens and others on this is to talk about it in that commercialization way. Because again, not everybody has to necessarily experience the negative harms for them to be harmful. I just want to end with this analogy. There's a professor out there named Carl Hart at Columbia who's openly talking about how he uses heroin and how that is, completely, fine. He uses heroin. He's successful. It's no problem. The drug war is a lie. And this person used to be a federally funded researcher. He's an endowed chair at an Ivy League university. It's hard to imagine, but he's saying these things openly. And my response to that is, well, I know a lot of people, or some people, not a lot. I know some people that regularly drive very, very fast on the highway, way above the speed limit. Now, they haven't died yet. They've gotten some of them in car accidents, car crashes, but they haven't died yet. Is that a reason to get rid of speed limits? Because we know some people who speed and don't die. Is that a reason to promote reckless driving and speeding? Of course not. For everybody, as a rule, we want to promote safe driving. We want to have speed limits. It doesn't matter if 1 or 2 people or a handful of people were able to drive fast. And, unfortunately, though, people respond to anecdote much more than they do evidence, which is another knock against only using science. It's another, reason why, Carlton, you're right. We need to think about different ways to talk about it. And I think commercialization is a key way we can talk about this, especially for the average person.
Thank you so much for this very good answer to Carlton's questions. And thank you again for being here with us.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I will be there in person next time, I promise. And please enjoy the rest of the conference and
Thank you
each other. Thank you for inviting me.
Have
I appreciate
a great
it.
day. Thanks. It was an honor.
Thank you. Yeah.